Imagine a vibrant, carefree 16-year-old heading out for what should have been a simple shopping trip, only to vanish without a trace. Decades later, her family still wonders what truly happened on that fateful day. Today, we're unraveling one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries of the 70s, the disappearance of Cathy Moulton, a story that leaves behind more questions than answers. Let's dive into the heart of it, but before we begin, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any updates on the most chilling cases you've never heard of. Cathy Moulton was more than just a name that would one day make headlines for tragic reasons. She was a bright and compassionate 16-year-old girl with her entire future ahead of her. Growing up in the tight-knit community of Portland, Maine, Cathy was the eldest daughter of Lyman and Claire Moulton. She had two younger sisters, and the family was well known in their neighborhood. Portland, although a growing town in the early 70s, still carried that small town feel where everyone knew each other and the sense of community was strong. Cathy was described as a kind-hearted, responsible young woman. Those who knew her best, her friends, family, and classmates, often spoke of her gentle nature and her tendency to be a peacemaker among her peers. She was someone who cared deeply for others, especially her family, and had a close bond with her parents and sisters. A high school junior, Cathy loved animals, was an avid reader, and took a special interest in fashion. Like many teenagers, she was trying to figure out who she wanted to be in the world, but she had dreams and ambitions, and everyone believed she would go far. She was also quite involved in her local church and enjoyed participating in community activities. Cathy had a group of close-knit friends who appreciated her loyalty and easygoing personality. People remember her as shy but never afraid to stand up for what was right. Her parents, especially her father, were deeply protective of her, though Portland was not a place where anyone thought such protection was urgently needed. After all, the community was considered safe, and no one imagined that something sinister could lurk around the corner. But that's the thing about small towns, sometimes the danger hides in plain sight. The day she disappeared started like any other. Cathy had plans to visit the local stores to shop for new clothes and shoes. It was a simple, mundane task, one that no one could have predicted would lead to a decades-long nightmare. As we begin this journey into Cathy Moulton's story, we have to remember her as more than a statistic. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend. Her disappearance isn't just a mystery, it's a tragedy that forever altered the lives of those who knew her. As we continue unraveling the twists and turns of Cathy's case, make sure to stay with us because what happens next will chill you to your core. Don't forget to share this video and leave a comment with your thoughts on what you think could have happened to Cathy. Could there still be hope for solving this case after all these years? It was a typical fall afternoon in Portland, Maine, and 16-year-old Cathy Moulton had plans for what seemed to be an ordinary day. She left her family's home around 1:30 in the afternoon, full of the excitement that comes with an opportunity to do some personal shopping. Her father, Lyman Moulton, had agreed to meet her later at the Iwaka, but before that, Cathy had her own agenda. She wanted to pick up some nylons and new shoes for the school year, as well as a few practical items. Nothing unusual about it. This was a routine Cathy was familiar with. She'd gone into downtown Portland before, always without incident. Cathy got a ride from a family friend who dropped her off at a popular shopping area near Congress Street, the heart of downtown. From here, her plan was to visit several stores and pick up the items she needed. Her first known stop was at a music store on Forest Avenue, where she successfully bought the nylons she was eager to get. Following this, she made her way to a local department store to pick up some personal items, including toothpaste. She was seen by several witnesses throughout the afternoon, and all seemed normal. Cathy was just another young girl enjoying a day in the city. But by the time the clock hit 2:30, Cathy was last spotted crossing Forest Avenue toward Cumberland Avenue. Witnesses recall that she was walking alone but seemed to have briefly spoken to someone inside a vehicle. This fleeting interaction would later become a crucial piece of the investigation, though the details surrounding it were unclear. The person in the car was never identified, and the contents of their conversation remain unknown. As Cathy continued on her way, the plan was simple. After finishing her shopping, she would meet her father at the Ilka around 5 o'clock, but Cathy never showed up. Hours passed, and what started as mild concern in the Moulton household soon escalated into panic. By the time the evening rolled around and Cathy was still missing, her family knew something was wrong. When Lyman Moulton began reaching out to friends and family, hoping to find out if Cathy had changed her plans or gotten delayed, it became clear that no one had seen or heard from her. The family contacted the Portland Police Department later that evening, but their initial response was frustratingly slow. The prevailing thought among law enforcement was that Cathy might have run away, a theory that haunted many missing persons cases during that era. Her family, however, insisted that Cathy would never have disappeared on her own. This was completely out of character for their responsible, well-grounded daughter. Despite the police's early hesitation, her disappearance would soon become an alarming mystery. Cathy's movements on that afternoon, so ordinary and routine, were suddenly shadowed by questions. She had disappeared in broad daylight in a busy part of the city, with witnesses recalling seeing her, yet no one could account for what happened after that brief encounter with the unidentified person in the car. As night fell on Portland, the search for Cathy began, but answers remained elusive. She had simply vanished, and with each passing hour, the chances of finding her grew slimmer. What should have been a simple shopping trip had turned into a nightmare, one that would grip her family and the community for decades to come. As the evening of September 24th, 1971, wore on, the unease in the Moulton household grew unbearable. Cathy was not the kind of teenager who would disappear without a word, especially when her father was expecting her at the Ibuka later that day. When she hadn't shown up by early evening, Lyman Moulton began making phone calls to Cathy's friends, hoping that she had simply been delayed or had lost track of time. But as he spoke to more people, it became clear that no one had seen Cathy since earlier that afternoon, and no one had any idea where she could be. It was then that the Moulton family realized something was terribly wrong. Lyman and his wife, Claire, didn't waste any time. They immediately contacted the Portland Police Department, hoping for swift action. However, the initial police response was far from the urgency that the Moultons expected. At that time, it was common for authorities to assume that teenagers, especially girls, may have run away, and Cathy's case was treated no differently. Despite the Moulton family's insistence that Cathy had no reason to run and that she was a responsible and dependable young woman, the police initially downplayed the seriousness of the situation. That night, the police suggested waiting to see if Cathy would return on her own, thinking she might have been out with friends. The Moulton family, however, knew better. This was entirely out of character for Cathy, and they couldn't shake the fear that something had gone horribly wrong. As police hesitated, Cathy's parents took matters into their own hands, reaching out to their community for help. Word spread quickly across Portland, and soon the small town's close-knit residents began to rally around the Moulton family. Within hours, local volunteers, neighbors, and friends mobilized to search for Cathy. Flyers were printed with her photograph and details, and the community began scouring the streets and areas where she was last seen. They retraced her steps, searching the shops she had visited earlier that day, asking anyone if they had seen anything suspicious or unusual. But despite the outpouring of support and the increasing number of people combing the streets, there was little to go on. Cathy had simply vanished without a trace. As the hours ticked by, the initial search efforts led to more questions than answers. There were no signs of a struggle, no clear indication of foul play, and no concrete leads to follow. Yet, despite this, the community refused to give up. Portland, though growing, still had that small town feel where people looked out for one another. This was someone's daughter, someone they had seen in school and in church, and her disappearance struck a chord with the entire town. The police, although slow to act at first, eventually started taking the case more seriously as days passed without any sign of Cathy. But in those crucial early hours, when every minute could have made a difference, the response was frustratingly passive. The delay in action, compounded by the lack of concrete leads, allowed precious time to slip away, time that might have been critical to solving the case. By the end of the first night, Cathy Moulton's disappearance was already taking on the weight of something far more sinister. The family's worst fears had begun to solidify. Their daughter was missing, and no one had any answers. The Moultons would have to face the agonizing truth that their lives had just been irrevocably changed, and the search for Cathy would become a long, painful road filled with uncertainty and heartbreak. In the critical hours following Cathy Moulton's disappearance, the response from law enforcement was unfortunately typical of the time. The 1970s were an era when police often defaulted to the assumption that teenagers, particularly girls, who went missing had simply run away. Cathy's case was no exception to this flawed logic. Despite the Moulton family's repeated insistence that Cathy was not the type to run away, the Portland Police Department was slow to launch an official investigation. The initial reaction from law enforcement was to treat Cathy's absence as a likely case of a runaway teen, something that was frustratingly common in police responses to missing persons during that time. In fact, it was not uncommon for police to suggest waiting a full 24 to 48 hours before escalating a missing person report, as they believed most teens would return on their own after a day or two. For Cathy's family, this lack of urgency was unbearable. They knew their daughter better than anyone, and they were certain that something far more troubling had occurred. The police's reluctance to act immediately meant that valuable time was lost in those crucial first hours when witnesses' memories were still fresh and when Cathy's trail could have been followed more effectively. As the hours stretched into days without a concentrated police effort, leads that might have been actionable began to fade. Potential witnesses who may have seen Cathy or noted something unusual were not interviewed promptly, allowing critical details to slip through the cracks. Additionally, this delay meant that the wider public, including those outside Cathy's immediate community, was not alerted soon enough. By the time authorities began treating Cathy's disappearance as something more than just a runaway, days had already passed, making it significantly harder to piece together her last movements or identify anyone who might have been involved. What was even more heartbreaking for Cathy's family was that this delay left them feeling helpless and unsupported by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The Moultons had done everything right. They reported Cathy missing immediately, organized local searches, and pushed the police for action. But with law enforcement hesitating, the window of opportunity to track down Cathy's whereabouts quickly was rapidly closing. It wasn't until several days after her disappearance that a formal investigation was launched, but by then the trail had gone cold. The slow response from the authorities may very well have been one of the most significant factors that hindered the investigation from the start. Without immediate attention, potential evidence was lost or overlooked, and the chances of finding Cathy alive diminished with each passing day. This delay not only impacted the investigation at that moment, but also set a precedent for the rest of the case, as it would go on to remain unsolved for decades, leaving the Moulton family with far too many unanswered questions. In retrospect, had the police treated Cathy's disappearance with the seriousness it warranted from the outset, the outcome could have been very different. But instead, the early stages of the investigation were marked by a lack of urgency, a decision that would haunt both the Moultons and the Portland Police Department for years to come. For the Moulton family, the hours and days following Cathy's disappearance were a nightmare that refused to end. With law enforcement slow to act and the reality of Cathy's absence sinking in, her parents, Lyman and Claire Moulton, knew that if they didn't take matters into their own hands, their daughter might never be found. They could not afford to sit back and wait for the police to catch up. Every passing hour felt like a missed opportunity, so they launched their own desperate campaign to bring attention to Cathy's case and keep it alive in the public eye. From the moment it became clear that Cathy had not simply wandered off or run away, the Moultons took action. Lyman, a quiet and determined man, and Claire, a mother heartbroken but unwavering in her resolve, spearheaded the search for their daughter. They canvassed their community, passing out flyers with Cathy's picture plastered on them. They urged neighbors, friends, and even strangers to join in the search. Portland was a close knit community, and the disappearance of one of their own stirred everyone into action. But for Lyman and Claire, the support of their community wasn't enough. They needed to broaden the scope of the search. They began calling local newspapers, pleading with journalists to cover Cathy's case and keep her face on the front pages. The family reached out to radio stations, hoping that a simple mention of Cathy's name would trigger someone's memory or prompt a new lead. They also attempted to get Cathy's story onto television, anything that might increase awareness and pressure the authorities to treat her case more seriously. In their interactions with the police, Lyman and Claire remained respectful but persistent. They understood the importance of maintaining a cooperative relationship with law enforcement, but they were also firm in their belief that the police had not done enough, fast enough. They repeatedly met with officers, detectives, and anyone who would listen, sharing every detail they could think of about Cathy and that fateful afternoon. They pushed for updates, demanding answers and accountability, but often found themselves frustrated by the lack of new information. Cathy's disappearance had quickly moved beyond being a local matter. The Moultons were convinced that if they could get her story out to a wider audience, someone, somewhere, might hold the key to finding their daughter. Lyman, though a man of few words, made it his mission to contact larger media outlets. He wrote letters and made phone calls to national newspapers, trying to get them to take interest in the case of a missing teenager from Maine. It was an exhausting effort, but the Moultons never wavered. They were determined that Cathy's name would not be forgotten. The family's efforts also included working closely with local search parties. Volunteers continued to comb the streets, the woods, and every corner of the town, hoping to find any trace of Cathy. Flyers were regularly updated, and new photographs of Cathy were distributed to keep her face fresh in the minds of those who might have seen her. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the lack of tangible progress was devastating. Despite the unrelenting heartbreak, Lyman and Claire's resolve only strengthened with time. They became fixtures at community events, using every opportunity to remind people that Cathy was still missing. As the case began to grow cold in the eyes of law enforcement, the Moultons refused to let Cathy's memory fade. They enlisted the help of private investigators, hoping that someone outside of the official police force might be able to uncover new leads. Through it all, the Moultons maintained a quiet dignity. They never gave in to despair, though the toll on their family was clear. Their other children felt the weight of their parents' anguish, and the loss of Cathy forever changed the dynamic in their once happy household. Yet, Lyman and Claire knew that giving up was not an option. Cathy was their daughter, and they owed it to her to keep searching, to keep her story alive, no matter how long it took. Even as the years passed and hope seemed to dim, the Moultons continued their efforts. They believed that as long as people were still talking about Cathy, there was still a chance to bring her home. Their desperate fight for answers was a testament to the depth of their love for their daughter, a fight that would endure for decades. In the days following Cathy Moulton's disappearance, as word spread throughout Portland and beyond, people began coming forward with potential sightings and information. The small town atmosphere meant that many people knew Cathy, or at least recognized her, and were eager to help in any way they could. These early leads offered glimmers of hope to the Moulton family, but they would also lead to frustration, as many of them turned out to be unreliable or dead ends. Still, they were critical in those first few weeks, and the police were compelled to investigate. One of the most significant early leads came from witnesses who reported seeing Cathy near a car on the afternoon of her disappearance. This sighting occurred around 2:30, not far from where she had been shopping in downtown Portland. Several people claimed to have seen Cathy standing by the side of the road, engaged in conversation with someone inside a vehicle. The car was described as either a light-colored or blue station wagon, though descriptions varied between witnesses. Some claimed she appeared to know the person in the vehicle, while others felt that something seemed off about the encounter. This particular sighting stood out to investigators as it marked the last confirmed moment anyone saw Cathy alive. The details, however, were frustratingly vague. No one could identify the driver or even provide a consistent description of the car. Nevertheless, the police treated this report as a crucial lead. They canvassed the area, asking local businesses and residents if they had noticed anything unusual that day or if they could recall any details about the car or the driver. Despite their efforts, the sighting near the car led to no concrete breakthroughs. There was no license plate number, no name attached to the mysterious driver, and no further reports that could clarify who this person was or why Cathy was speaking to them. The police even tried reaching out to nearby towns, hoping to find someone who might have seen a car matching the description or who might have noticed a teenage girl matching Cathy's description being taken into another town. But nothing definitive came from it. In addition to this report, there were other supposed sightings of Cathy on the day she disappeared and in the days that followed. One witness reported seeing a girl who looked like Cathy walking along the side of the road near Route 1, a few miles from downtown Portland. This lead, though intriguing, raised more questions than answers. If it was Cathy, what was she doing there? Had she been trying to get home on foot? Or was she attempting to flag someone down for help? Again, the police followed up on this sighting, questioning anyone who might have been in the area at the time. Unfortunately, this lead, like so many others, went nowhere. The girl seen on Route 1 could not be positively identified as Cathy, and without further evidence, the police were left with more speculation than solid information. As the investigation wore on, the police received additional reports from individuals who believed they had seen Cathy in the days after her disappearance. Some claimed to have spotted her in other parts of Maine, while others thought they had seen her as far away as New Hampshire. These leads were pursued as well, but none could be substantiated. The problem with these kinds of eyewitness reports is that memory is often unreliable, especially when days or weeks have passed. People's recollections can be clouded by uncertainty, and in cases of missing persons, there is always a risk of mistaken identity. Despite the flurry of reports that came in during the early days of the investigation, none of them led to a solid break in the case. The sightings of Cathy near the car and along the roadside remained the most compelling, but without further evidence or additional witnesses to corroborate the story, the police could only speculate about what had really happened in those final moments before Cathy vanished. For the Moulton family, these early leads were a source of both hope and anguish. Each new report brought with it a brief glimmer of optimism that maybe someone had seen Cathy, that maybe she was still out there waiting to be found. But with each lead that fizzled out, that hope grew harder to hold on to. The police, though initially slow to act, did follow up on these leads as best as they could, but without the technology and resources available today, the investigation was hindered by the limitations of the time. As weeks passed, the flow of new leads began to slow down and the investigation would eventually stall. But those early witness reports, Cathy seen by a car standing on the side of the road, would remain haunting details in a case that would grow colder with each passing day. As the investigation into Cathy Moulton's disappearance began to take shape, police shifted their focus to identifying potential suspects. Although the early leads centered around witness reports, law enforcement had to consider whether someone known to Cathy or from the local community might have been involved in her vanishing. Despite the seemingly quiet and close knit nature of Portland, Maine, investigators understood that anyone, friends, acquaintances, or even complete strangers could have played a role in her disappearance. One of the first avenues police explored was Cathy's personal circle. They interviewed her family, friends, and classmates, looking for any signs of trouble or individuals who might have harbored ill intentions toward her. Cathy was known to be a reserved, well-behaved young woman with a strong moral compass. There were no reports of any romantic entanglements, personal disputes, or behaviors that might have put her in conflict with anyone in her life. As a result, the search for someone within her social sphere who might have wanted to harm her proved fruitless. However, the police did not stop there. They expanded their investigation to include people who might have had brief or indirect contact with Cathy, including those who lived or worked in downtown Portland. One individual who garnered some early attention was a local shopkeeper who had interacted with Cathy on the day she went missing. The man had seen Cathy during her shopping trip, but after questioning, investigators determined that he had no involvement and was quickly ruled out as a suspect. As time went on and the investigation began to grow colder, the police broadened their focus beyond people directly connected to Cathy. They began looking into individuals who had a history of criminal behavior in the area, particularly those involved in violent or predatory crimes. One person who came onto their radar was a known sex offender who had been in Portland at the time of Cathy's disappearance. The man had a troubling history, and his presence in the area raised red flags. Despite this, there was no concrete evidence linking him to Cathy's case. He was questioned extensively but was ultimately released without charges due to the lack of physical proof tying him to the crime. The police also looked into possible suspects from outside Portland. In the months following Cathy's disappearance, there had been several other cases of missing teenagers across New England. Investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that Cathy's abduction might be part of a larger pattern, potentially the work of a serial offender. This theory gained traction when Cathy's case was later linked to a man named Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, a convicted child predator who had been active in the region during the early 1970s. Bar-Jonah, a deeply disturbing figure, had a long history of violent behavior, particularly toward children. After his arrest in Montana years later for the abduction and murder of a young boy, investigators began reviewing his activities in other parts of the country, including Maine. Bar-Jonah's movements were scrutinized, and at one point he even claimed to have knowledge of Cathy Moulton's disappearance. His history and proximity to the area during the time of Cathy's vanishing made him a strong suspect. However, like many elements of Bar-Jonah's confessions, his claims were inconsistent and much of what he said could not be verified. Other individuals who were looked into included transient workers and drifters who had passed through the Portland area in the months surrounding Cathy's disappearance. The police questioned anyone who seemed suspicious or had a criminal record, particularly those with histories of violence against women or children. But once again, the lack of physical evidence, no body, no belongings, no definitive crime scene meant that no charges could be brought against any of these individuals. In Cathy's case, the frustration for investigators was not a shortage of suspects, but a shortage of actionable evidence. Many people were questioned, some with criminal pasts, others with possible motives, but none of them could be definitively tied to Cathy's disappearance. Each time a new name surfaced, it was met with hope that it might lead to a breakthrough, but each time the result was the same: more dead ends. Cathy's disappearance left behind a vacuum of information, and while the police explored every possible lead, the early suspects either lacked motive, opportunity, or the kind of hard evidence needed to make an arrest. To this day, no one has been officially charged in connection with Cathy Moulton's case, leaving a trail of unanswered questions and haunting what ifs. The early suspects in Cathy's case, whether known to her or complete strangers, remain part of a larger mystery that has yet to be solved. Each possible connection, each dead end, has contributed to the coldness of the case, leaving her family and investigators still searching for the truth. In the days following Cathy Moulton's disappearance, one of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was the persistent belief held by the authorities that Cathy had simply run away. This theory, while initially common in cases involving missing teenagers during the 1970s, became a central point of contention between the Moulton family and law enforcement. Despite Cathy's parents, Lyman and Claire Moulton, repeatedly insisting that Cathy had no reason to run away, the theory continued to shape the early stages of the investigation, resulting in critical delays that may have cost valuable time. The idea that Cathy had run away was rooted in the mindset of the era. In the 1970s, it was not uncommon for teenagers to be labeled as runaways when they went missing, particularly if there were no immediate signs of foul play, such as evidence of a struggle or abduction. For law enforcement, this was often a convenient explanation, one that allowed them to treat a case with less urgency in the hope that the missing individual would eventually return home on their own. In Cathy's case, there were no initial signs of violence, no obvious indications that she had been forcibly taken. She had been out shopping alone in a familiar part of town and was seen talking to someone in a car, leading some investigators to believe that perhaps she had voluntarily left with someone. The fact that she was a teenage girl added fuel to the assumption. Runaway cases were often dismissed as rebellious acts, especially if the missing person had shown any hint of dissatisfaction at home or school. However, Cathy's family was adamant that the runaway theory was entirely out of character for their daughter. Cathy had always been a responsible, reliable teenager with a strong moral compass. She had no history of trouble at home or in school, no conflicts that would suggest she was unhappy or planning to leave. In fact, Cathy had left her home that afternoon with plans to meet her father later at the Ilka, and her family knew she was excited about the new clothes she intended to buy. For her to suddenly abandon those plans without any explanation made no sense to those who knew her best. Cathy's parents fought tirelessly to convince the authorities that their daughter was not a runaway, but the theory persisted for several frustrating reasons. One key factor was the lack of immediate evidence suggesting abduction or foul play. In the absence of a clear crime scene, the police defaulted to the runaway theory as a placeholder explanation. This allowed them to avoid the time-consuming and costly process of launching a full-scale search, at least in the critical early days. Moreover, the runaway theory was often reinforced by societal attitudes toward missing teenagers. In that era, it was easy for authorities to dismiss cases involving young girls as runaway situations, even when the families insisted otherwise. There was a tendency to downplay the seriousness of such disappearances, assuming that teenagers would return home when they were ready. This was a time before widespread media attention on missing children and before high-profile cases like those of Ethan Patz and Adam Walsh changed the way authorities approached missing persons. The Moulton family's efforts to push back against this theory were met with bureaucratic resistance. Police protocols of the time required waiting periods before escalating missing persons cases, and the runaway narrative gave the police a reason to delay action. This lack of immediate investigation meant that valuable time was lost, and by the time the runaway theory was finally abandoned, the trail had gone cold. In retrospect, the persistence of the runaway theory had a profound impact on the investigation. While it's impossible to say for certain whether an earlier, more focused response could have changed the outcome, the delay in treating Cathy's case as a potential abduction hindered efforts to gather evidence and pursue leads while they were still fresh. Witnesses who might have remembered seeing Cathy or her potential abductor were not interviewed until days or even weeks later, and any physical evidence that might have been present had long since disappeared. For Cathy's family, the runaway theory was not just an insult to their daughter's character, but a devastating obstacle in their search for answers. Lyman and Claire knew their daughter better than anyone, and they were certain that she had not run away. Yet, the authorities' reluctance to abandon this theory forced the family to fight harder, not only to find Cathy, but to convince those in power to take her disappearance seriously. The tragic truth was that by the time the police finally shifted their focus away from the runaway theory, too much time had already been lost. The runaway theory persisted because it was convenient, fitting the narrative of the time, but it ignored the reality of who Cathy Moulton was and the clear evidence that she had no reason to leave her life behind. It was a theory that, despite being proven unlikely, continues to haunt the early days of the investigation and remains a painful reminder of the missed opportunities to find her. As weeks turned into months, the disappearance of Cathy Moulton began to drift into a painful stalemate. Despite the desperate efforts of her family, the early witness reports, and the countless leads that investigators chased, nothing tangible emerged. The initial momentum, fueled by community involvement, media coverage, and active police work, gradually began to slow. The trail was getting colder by the day. By late autumn of 1971, the buzz that once surrounded Cathy's case started to fade from the front pages of newspapers. The public's interest, while still present, was waning. Portland was a small town, and without new developments, people moved on. The media, which had initially covered Cathy's disappearance extensively, found fewer reasons to revisit the case as time passed. In the absence of fresh leads or new angles, Cathy's name slowly slipped from the headlines and her face from the public consciousness. For the Moulton family, this fading attention was nothing short of a nightmare. Cathy had vanished without a trace, and now it seemed that the world was beginning to forget her. As days became weeks and weeks stretched into months, the investigation ground to a halt. Leads that had once seemed promising were either exhausted or discredited. Witnesses who had reported seeing Cathy could no longer recall key details, and even those early, vague sightings like Cathy near the car or on the side of the road led nowhere concrete. The lack of physical evidence played a significant role in the case going cold. Without Cathy's body, any personal belongings, or definitive proof of foul play, investigators found themselves grasping at straws. Police files grew thicker with unsubstantiated reports and dead ends, but they lacked the critical pieces needed to make real progress. Every theory, whether it was Cathy being taken by someone she knew, a stranger abduction, or something else entirely, was purely speculative. Nothing solidified. The runaway theory, which had already delayed the investigation at the start, left a lingering effect. The time lost early on meant that critical opportunities to gather evidence had been missed. By the time authorities fully shifted their focus from treating Cathy as a runaway to investigating her as a missing person, the trail had gone cold. Key witnesses had moved on, details had faded, and potential clues were lost. The lack of media attention also contributed to the case's stagnation. In the early weeks, the Moulton family had successfully kept Cathy's story alive through newspaper articles, radio, and local television. But as time wore on, other news stories took center stage. Without new information to report, the media lost interest, and with that, the pressure on law enforcement began to ease. The urgency that had once driven the investigation diminished, and Cathy's case was slowly pushed to the background. While police continued to follow up on occasional tips, the reality was that new leads were scarce. Investigators worked with what little they had, but as the months dragged on, they found themselves with fewer and fewer places to turn. The case wasn't officially closed, but the resources dedicated to it dwindled. Cathy's name remained in the files, but there were no new breakthroughs, no sudden revelations that could propel the investigation forward. The emotional toll on the Moulton family was immeasurable. Lyman and Claire Moulton, despite their unrelenting efforts to keep Cathy's case in the public eye, began to realize that they were fighting an uphill battle. They continued to contact the police regularly, hoping for any glimmer of hope, but the answers were always the same: no new leads, no new evidence, no sign of Cathy. The helplessness they felt as their daughter's case grew colder was compounded by the frustration of knowing that without public interest, the investigation would only continue to lose momentum. For Cathy's friends, classmates, and the local community, her disappearance remained a topic of conversation for a time, but eventually even that faded. People moved on with their lives, and while the Moulton family continued to feel the weight of their loss every single day, for many, Cathy's case became just another unsolved mystery, a tragedy, but one with no clear answers. By the time winter set in, the once vibrant search efforts had largely ceased. Volunteers who had spent days combing through Portland and its outskirts now returned to their routines, and the police, with no fresh information, shifted their focus to other cases. The silence around Cathy's disappearance grew heavier with each passing day, and the hope that once fueled the investigation began to wane. The disappearance of Cathy Moulton had, in the span of just a few months, gone from a front page mystery to a cold case. Despite the persistence of her family, the efforts of local authorities, and the initial wave of community support, the trail had gone cold. Cathy had simply vanished, and with no answers in sight, her case slipped into the shadows, leaving her family and Portland haunted by the question of what really happened on that September afternoon. For years, Cathy Moulton's case remained in the shadows, a cold case that had slowly faded from the public eye. Her family never stopped searching for answers, but the silence from law enforcement and the lack of new leads weighed heavily on them. However, as with many cold cases, Cathy's disappearance would eventually find its way back into the spotlight decades later when renewed interest sparked fresh inquiries and brought her name back into the public consciousness. It wasn't until the late 90s and early 2000s, when the explosion of interest in cold cases and true crime stories took hold of the media, that Cathy's case began to see a resurgence. As the public's fascination with unsolved mysteries grew, media outlets and independent investigators started to re-examine cases that had long been dormant, and Cathy's disappearance from 1971 was one such case that began to attract renewed attention. Television networks and documentary filmmakers, now eager to produce content centered on unsolved cases, revisited Cathy's story. True crime programs such as Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted offered platforms that Cathy's family had never had before. These programs introduced Cathy's case to a whole new audience, many of whom had never heard her story. Cathy's photograph once again appeared on screens across the country, and the details of her last known movements were recounted in a way that captivated audiences and brought new life to a case that had long been cold. This media attention also triggered renewed efforts from both professional investigators and amateur sleuths, some of whom were driven by personal curiosity, while others were passionate about seeking justice for unsolved cases. The advent of the internet allowed amateur detectives to communicate and collaborate in ways that had never been possible before. Online forums dedicated to solving cold cases began to spring up, and Cathy's case, along with many others, found a dedicated group of internet sleuths determined to piece together the clues that had been overlooked or forgotten for so many years. One of the major moments in this renewed interest came when the name Nathaniel Bar-Jonah surfaced. Bar-Jonah, a convicted child predator, was arrested in Montana in 2001 for the abduction and murder of a young boy. During the investigation into his horrific crimes, authorities discovered that Bar-Jonah had lived in Maine during the 1970s, and he quickly became a suspect in several unsolved cases from that period, including Cathy Moulton's. Bar-Jonah's violent history and proximity to Portland at the time of Cathy's disappearance were chilling coincidences. In fact, during the course of his trial, Bar-Jonah made several cryptic comments about other victims, even suggesting that he had knowledge of Cathy's fate. investigators looked closely at his possible connection to the Moulton case, but as with many aspects of Bar-Jonah's life, his statements were unreliable, often contradictory, and at times seemed to be attention-seeking fabrications. Still, his name brought a flood of new interest into Cathy's case. Police re-interviewed witnesses and revisited old evidence in light of the possibility that Bar-Jonah had been involved, though they were unable to definitively link him to Cathy's disappearance. The renewed media attention and the potential Bar-Jonah connection re-energized Cathy's case. Amateur sleuths began poring over every detail that had been made public, searching for new clues in the old evidence. With advancements in forensic technology, there was hope that even decades-old cases like Cathy's could still yield new leads. Investigators reopened Cathy's case files, combing through them with fresh eyes and applying modern investigative techniques where possible. The internet forums became a hub for speculation, theories, and the sharing of information. People who had been living in Portland at the time of Cathy's disappearance came forward with new memories, however vague, and these details were analyzed by both amateur detectives and law enforcement alike. Some users went as far as digging through old newspaper archives, seeking to understand the context of Cathy's disappearance and what the police might have missed back in 1971. While Bar-Jonah was ultimately never charged in connection with Cathy's case, the renewed attention on her disappearance opened the door for further investigation. Some private investigators took up the case, working alongside the Moulton family to explore new possibilities. These efforts, though well-meaning, often led to frustrating dead ends. But the Moulton family was grateful for the renewed interest. After decades of silence, the world was talking about Cathy again. By the early 2000s, the cold case units across the country were gaining more prominence, and Cathy's case was on their radar once again. However, despite the renewed media attention, the Bar-Jonah lead, and the amateur sleuthing that breathed new life into the case, Cathy's fate remained elusive. The investigation continued to be hampered by the lack of physical evidence, and no major breakthroughs emerged. For Cathy's parents, Lyman and Claire, the renewed interest was bittersweet. It brought their daughter's name back into the spotlight and offered a glimmer of hope, but it also resurfaced the anguish of her disappearance. Still, they remained steadfast in their belief that one day the truth would come to light and someone would finally uncover what happened to their daughter all those years ago. As of today, Cathy Moulton's case remains unsolved, but the renewed interest from investigators, true crime enthusiasts, and the broader public has kept her story alive. The resurgence of attention in the late 90s and early 2000s didn't bring about a final answer, but it reignited the search for justice, and for the Moulton family, that search continues. By the mid-80s, Cathy Moulton's case had grown cold. Leads had dried up, the media had moved on, and her family was left with decades of unanswered questions. But in the unsettling world of unsolved cases, breakthroughs often come from the darkest of places. In this instance, a potential lead surfaced from within the prison walls of one of the most notorious child predators in the country, Nathaniel Bar-Jonah. Bar-Jonah's criminal record read like a nightmare. He was a serial predator with a long history of targeting young children, luring them away from safety, and committing unspeakable acts. He had been convicted of multiple crimes, including attempted murder and abduction, and by the time his name entered the picture of Cathy Moulton's case, Bar-Jonah was already behind bars. His crimes stretched across states, leaving a trail of broken lives in his wake. But as he sat in his cell, his twisted legacy took a new turn. Bar-Jonah began to talk, and what he claimed sent shockwaves through law enforcement. In a chilling confession, Bar-Jonah told investigators that he knew what had happened to Cathy Moulton. According to his version of events, he had crossed paths with Cathy on the day of her disappearance in 1971. Bar-Jonah claimed he lured her into his vehicle, abducted her, and ultimately killed her. The possibility that this violent predator could have been responsible for Cathy's fate felt like a revelation, a horrifying but significant break in the case. At first glance, Bar-Jonah's confession seemed to align with some of the details from Cathy's disappearance. The reports of Cathy talking to someone in a car on the day she vanished made his story eerily plausible. His criminal history, his penchant for targeting young girls, and his presence in Maine during the early 70s all added to the weight of his confession. It seemed that, after all these years, the Moulton family might finally have a glimpse of the truth. But as investigators delved deeper into Bar-Jonah's story, the cracks in his narrative began to show. His claims, while sensational, were inconsistent and often contradictory. He provided few details that could be verified. He couldn't describe what Cathy had been wearing, nor could he remember exactly where or when the crime supposedly took place. His recollection of events shifted with each retelling, leaving investigators frustrated and skeptical of his involvement. Bar-Jonah was known for his manipulative behavior. He thrived on attention, and his confessions often seemed more like attempts to insert himself into high-profile cases than genuine admissions of guilt. It became clear to investigators that Bar-Jonah's story, while horrifying, lacked the kind of hard evidence needed to prove his involvement in Cathy's disappearance. His connection to her case was, at best, speculative. Nevertheless, Bar-Jonah's confession reignited interest in Cathy's case. Investigators took his claims seriously enough to reopen their files, re-examine the evidence, and look for any potential links between Cathy and Bar-Jonah. But despite their best efforts, they couldn't find anything concrete to tie him to her disappearance. No new witnesses came forward, no physical evidence emerged, and no definitive proof surfaced to back up Bar-Jonah's chilling account. For Cathy's family, Bar-Jonah's confession was a cruel reminder of how elusive closure can be in a case like theirs. The possibility that this man, a monster who had harmed so many others, might have taken their daughter haunted them. But without solid evidence, they were left in limbo, caught between wanting to believe they were finally closer to the truth and fearing that Bar-Jonah's words were nothing more than another dead end. Bar-Jonah would go on to claim involvement in other unsolved cases, but as was the pattern with many of his confessions, none of them could be substantiated. His legacy of violence and manipulation only added to the confusion surrounding Cathy's disappearance. In the end, his confession, while disturbing, failed to provide the breakthrough Cathy's family so desperately needed. Though Bar-Jonah's claims were ultimately dismissed as unreliable, his confession left an indelible mark on the investigation. It reminded the Moulton family and the world that Cathy's case, though cold, was far from forgotten. It also underscored the unsettling reality that even decades after her disappearance, the truth remained frustratingly out of reach. Cathy Moulton's fate, like so many other cold cases, remained unsolved. The shadow of Nathaniel Bar-Jonah loomed over the investigation, but without the evidence to back his words, the question of what really happened to Cathy remained unanswered. The case, for now, slipped back into the darkness where it had lingered for so long. Nathaniel Bar-Jonah was the embodiment of a predator, an individual whose dark and twisted history left a trail of devastation across multiple states. His name is synonymous with some of the most horrific crimes against children, and his very existence seemed to encapsulate the worst nightmares of every parent. By the time his name became linked to Cathy Moulton's case, Bar-Jonah had already established himself as one of the most disturbing figures in criminal history. His violent past and proximity to Maine during Cathy's disappearance made him a credible suspect, though the depths of his depravity would only come fully to light years later. Born David Paul Brown in Massachusetts in 1957, Bar-Jonah exhibited alarming behavior from an early age. As a child, he demonstrated an unusual fascination with death and violence. By the time he was 7, Bar-Jonah was already experimenting with sadistic fantasies, often targeting neighborhood children. His obsession with control and power over others quickly escalated into real-world acts of violence. His first known offense occurred in 1975 when he attempted to lure a young boy into his car while impersonating a police officer. Though the boy managed to escape, this incident foreshadowed the violence Bar-Jonah would later unleash. Bar-Jonah's criminal record grew darker and more disturbing as he entered adulthood. His primary targets were young boys and girls whom he lured away from safety using manipulation, deceit, and often brute force. He was a master of disguise, often posing as an authority figure or a trustworthy adult to gain the trust of his victims. His crimes ranged from abduction and assault to attempted murder, and in each case, his actions reflected a deep and terrifying compulsion to harm children. Bar-Jonah's most notorious crime occurred in 1977 when he kidnapped two boys from a Massachusetts neighborhood. After luring them into a secluded area, Bar-Jonah assaulted them, leaving one boy barely alive and the other severely traumatized. He was arrested and convicted for this crime, but despite the gravity of his offenses, Bar-Jonah was sentenced to a psychiatric facility rather than a prison. His time in the facility did little to rehabilitate him, and after his release, he continued his violent ways. His criminal behavior persisted for decades as he moved from state to state, leaving a trail of missing children and unsolved cases in his wake. What made Bar-Jonah particularly terrifying was not just his ability to evade capture for long stretches of time, but the sheer brutality with which he treated his victims. In several cases, he demonstrated a cannibalistic obsession, which was later uncovered when investigators found disturbing evidence in his Montana home, including human bones and bloodied cooking utensils. These gruesome discoveries suggested that Bar-Jonah's depravity went far beyond abduction and murder. He had crossed into a realm of evil that was almost unimaginable. Given this history, it's no surprise that when Bar-Jonah's name surfaced in connection to Cathy Moulton's disappearance, investigators took his claims seriously. His history of abducting and murdering children placed him firmly in the category of suspects who were capable of committing such a heinous act. Bar-Jonah had been living in Maine during the 1970s, the same time that Cathy vanished, which further fueled suspicions about his involvement. His criminal profile, a man who thrived on violence, power, and the suffering of children, aligned too well with the possibility that he could have taken Cathy. However, despite the seemingly logical connection between Bar-Jonah and Cathy's case, there were complications. His confessions, though horrifying, were inconsistent and often lacked the specific details that would confirm his involvement. This was a pattern seen throughout Bar-Jonah's life. He would frequently admit to crimes or claim knowledge of disappearances, but much of what he said could not be substantiated. His tendency to seek attention, combined with his manipulation of law enforcement, made it difficult to separate fact from fiction. Yet, despite the doubts surrounding his confession, Bar-Jonah remained a credible suspect in Cathy's disappearance because of his demonstrated ability to commit such crimes. His history with other missing children, his predatory nature, and his proximity to Portland during the time of Cathy's disappearance made it impossible for investigators to dismiss him outright. While no hard evidence directly linked him to Cathy, his overall criminal profile left little room for doubt about his capacity for violence. Bar-Jonah's case remains one of the most haunting examples of how a predator can slip through the cracks of the justice system. Despite his numerous arrests, convictions, and imprisonments, he managed to continue his violent spree for years, preying on the most vulnerable members of society. His criminal background paints the portrait of a man whose evil knew no limits, a man who repeatedly sought out children to satisfy his horrific desires. Though his involvement in Cathy Moulton's case remains speculative, his legacy of violence casts a long shadow over her disappearance. Ultimately, Nathaniel Bar-Jonah's profile as a serial predator, combined with his proximity to Cathy's disappearance, made him one of the most viable suspects in the case. His life was a dark and terrifying journey through the depths of human cruelty, and even though his confession regarding Cathy's fate could not be fully trusted, his potential involvement remains one of the more disturbing possibilities in this unsolved mystery. Nathaniel Bar-Jonah's confession regarding Cathy Moulton's disappearance, while initially a chilling development in the cold case, quickly began to unravel under scrutiny. Although his claim to have abducted and murdered Cathy seemed plausible given his history, the details he provided raised red flags for investigators. The inconsistencies and contradictions within his statements not only weakened the credibility of his confession, but also led many to believe that Bar-Jonah might have been seeking attention rather than offering genuine information. One of the most glaring issues with Bar-Jonah's confession was his inability to provide specific details about Cathy Moulton that could definitively tie him to her disappearance. Investigators often look for concrete, verifiable facts in a confession, details that only the perpetrator would know. In Bar-Jonah's case, he failed to recall key information about Cathy's appearance, what she was wearing on the day she vanished, or even the exact location where the abduction allegedly took place. This vagueness in his confession cast doubt on whether he truly had first-hand knowledge of the crime. Moreover, Bar-Jonah's version of events changed over time. In some instances, he claimed to have abducted Cathy from a busy street in Portland, while in other versions of the story, he described a more rural setting. These discrepancies in his narrative made it difficult for investigators to trust the accuracy of his statements. If Bar-Jonah had indeed been responsible for Cathy's disappearance, it would have been expected that he could describe these details with clarity and consistency, especially given the violent nature of his crimes and the control he exercised over his victims. Another problem was Bar-Jonah's inability to provide any physical evidence or reveal the location of Cathy's remains. A confession without evidence is often difficult to verify, but it can still lead to valuable information, such as the recovery of a body or personal belongings. In Bar-Jonah's case, however, there was no such breakthrough. Despite claiming to know what had happened to Cathy, he offered no specifics that could guide investigators to her remains or to any of her personal effects. This lack of physical corroboration was a major strike against the credibility of his confession. In addition to the inconsistencies in his story, Bar-Jonah had a long history of manipulation and deception, particularly when it came to law enforcement. He had been known to insert himself into high-profile cases and make false claims about his involvement in crimes for the sole purpose of gaining attention. Bar-Jonah thrived on being the center of controversy, and his confessions often seemed to be more about asserting his dominance and power than about revealing any real truths. His pattern of behavior in this regard led many investigators to believe that his confession in Cathy's case was just another instance of his attempts to manipulate the system and attract media attention. Investigators, while initially intrigued by Bar-Jonah's claims, quickly became skeptical as the inconsistencies mounted. They analyzed his confessions carefully, looking for any small details that might have been plausible, but ultimately nothing he said led them closer to solving the case. The changing narratives, the lack of evidence, and Bar-Jonah's reputation as a manipulator all contributed to the growing belief that he was simply trying to insert himself into another unsolved mystery. Still, there were some aspects of his confession that investigators found difficult to ignore. His proximity to Maine during the early 1970s, when Cathy disappeared, was a key factor that made his involvement seem possible. Bar-Jonah's established pattern of abducting and murdering children fit the profile of what might have happened to Cathy, especially considering the witness reports of her speaking to someone in a car shortly before she vanished. His known history of targeting young girls and his demonstrated ability to evade capture for years made it easy to believe that he could have been involved, but even these circumstantial connections weren't enough to substantiate his claims. What became clear to investigators over time was that while Bar-Jonah's confession might have contained elements of truth, it was impossible to verify. His storytelling was erratic, and his motivations seemed more rooted in his desire for control and attention than in any real desire to confess. Bar-Jonah had spent years toying with law enforcement, providing just enough information to stay relevant while withholding the facts that could lead to closure. In Cathy's case, this pattern repeated itself. Ultimately, Bar-Jonah's confession was seen as problematic for a variety of reasons. The inconsistencies in his story, the lack of verifiable details, and his long history of manipulation all contributed to the conclusion that his claims were unreliable. While his background as a violent predator made him a credible suspect, his confession alone was not enough to advance the investigation. For Cathy's family, Bar-Jonah's confession was another cruel twist in their decades-long search for answers. They were left with more questions than ever, wondering if Bar-Jonah's involvement was real or just another lie spun by a deeply disturbed man. In the end, Bar-Jonah's confession did little to bring them closer to the truth. It was yet another dead end in a case filled with heartbreak and uncertainty. Cathy Moulton's disappearance in 1971 was not an isolated event. As the years passed, her case began to echo the tragic stories of other missing children in New England. These unsolved cases, scattered across the region and spanning several decades, carried eerie similarities to Cathy's. Could these disappearances be connected? Investigators and amateur sleuths alike have speculated that Cathy's case might be linked to other missing children, raising the chilling possibility that a serial predator could have been operating in the area during that time. One of the most striking aspects of Cathy's disappearance is its resemblance to several other cases of missing girls in Maine and neighboring states. Between the late 1960s and early 1980s, several young people vanished under similar circumstances, teenagers going about their everyday lives only to disappear without a trace. The absence of any physical evidence, such as a body or belongings, in these cases, as in Cathy's, only deepened the mystery. Perhaps the most significant potential link was between Cathy's disappearance and that of 12-year-old Deborah Horn, who vanished from Augusta, Maine in 1973, just 2 years after Cathy. Like Cathy, Deborah had been walking alone near her home when she disappeared, and despite widespread searches, no trace of her was ever found. The lack of evidence and the seemingly random nature of the disappearance left investigators wondering if the same person could be responsible for both cases. Though no hard evidence tied the two disappearances together, the similarities were hard to ignore. Another possible connection was to the case of Mary Catherine Olenchuk, a 13-year-old girl who vanished from Ogunquit, Maine in 1970. Mary was last seen riding her bike near a popular resort area. Days later, her body was found in a barn miles away from where she disappeared. The brutality of the crime and the fact that Mary's killer was never caught suggested that a dangerous predator was active in Maine at the time. Some investigators speculated that the same person could have been responsible for Cathy's disappearance, though Cathy's case lacked the violent aftermath that Mary's case revealed. Outside of Maine, there were other cases that hinted at a larger pattern of abductions across New England. One of the most notorious was the case of 15-year-old Janice Pocket, who disappeared while riding her bike near her home in Connecticut in 1973. Like Cathy, Janice was never found, and her disappearance remains one of the state's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The similarities between Cathy and Janice's cases, both involving young girls in rural or semi-rural areas, both disappearing without a trace, led some investigators to consider the possibility that a traveling predator might have been responsible for multiple disappearances across state lines. The potential link between Cathy's case and other missing children gained even more traction when the FBI became involved in reviewing cold cases across New England. By the 1980s and 90s, law enforcement agencies across multiple states were beginning to collaborate more effectively, sharing information on unsolved cases that might point to a serial abductor or killer. While no concrete connections were made at the time, the theory that Cathy's disappearance was part of a larger pattern was firmly in place.
Nathaniel Bar-Jonah's confession added another disturbing layer to these potential links. As investigators dug into Bar-Jonah's past, they discovered that he had been in the New England region during the time of several of these disappearances. His history as a predator who targeted children, combined with his transient lifestyle, raised the possibility that he could have been involved in more than just Cathy's case.
Bar-Jonah was known to move between states, and his time in Maine, Massachusetts, and neighboring regions overlapped with the disappearances of several young girls, including Cathy. Though no physical evidence ever tied him to these cases, his name became synonymous with a dark period in New England's history when young people were vanishing without a trace. Despite the similarities between these cases, linking Cathy's disappearance to others has remained elusive. Investigators continue to examine the possibility of a connection, but the lack of evidence, particularly in Cathy's case, makes it difficult to draw definitive conclusions. In some instances, the time frames, methods, or locations differed just enough to cast doubt on the theory of a single perpetrator. Still, the possibility of a connection between Cathy's case and others like Deborah Horn, Mary Catherine Olenchuk, and Janice Pocket remains an open question. As cold case detectives and amateur sleuths have revisited these unsolved disappearances over the years, the notion that a serial predator may have been responsible for multiple missing children cases has never been far from their minds. The haunting similarities between Cathy's disappearance and the others from that era continue to fuel speculation that her abduction was not an isolated incident but part of a larger, more sinister pattern. In many ways, Cathy's case and others like it serve as grim reminders of how vulnerable young people were during this period in American history. The possibility of a connection to other missing children cases in the region only deepens the mystery of Cathy Moulton's fate. Whether she was the victim of a serial predator or another type of tragedy altogether, the parallels between her case and others leave open the chilling possibility that one person could have been responsible for the disappearances of multiple young people across New England during the 70s.
Cathy Moulton's disappearance in 1971 not only shattered the sense of safety in Portland, Maine, but it also dealt an irreversible blow to her family, leaving them engulfed in a void that could never be filled. The Moulton family, once a close-knit and loving household, was forced to confront the agonizing reality that Cathy's absence would haunt them indefinitely. Over the years, as the search for answers dragged on with no resolution, the psychological toll of her disappearance carved deep scars in the lives of her parents and siblings.
For Lyman and Claire Moulton, Cathy's parents, the loss was more than just the disappearance of their eldest daughter. It was the loss of hope, the loss of a future they had envisioned for her, and the destruction of any sense of normalcy they might have known. In the immediate aftermath of Cathy's vanishing, Lyman and Claire threw themselves into the search with everything they had. Their days were consumed with organizing search efforts, meeting with investigators, and tirelessly keeping Cathy's case in the public eye. But as weeks turned into months and months stretched into years, the weight of their unanswered questions became unbearable. Lyman Moulton, a quiet but determined man, was known to maintain a stoic demeanor, but the toll of Cathy's disappearance was evident. He became a constant presence at the Portland Police Department, checking in on the status of the investigation, hoping for even the slightest hint of progress. Over time, the lack of closure took its toll on him both mentally and physically. He aged rapidly in the years following Cathy's disappearance, the relentless heartache draining his energy and dimming his spirit. His desperation for answers was palpable, and yet he never found the peace he so desperately sought. Cathy's disappearance weighed on him until the day he passed, never knowing what had become of his daughter. For Claire Moulton, Cathy's mother, the pain was even more profound. The loss of a child is often described as an indescribable grief, and for Claire, that grief was only amplified by the fact that there was no closure, no finality. There was no body to bury, no place to mourn, only the aching void of uncertainty. In the early years after Cathy vanished, Claire held on to hope that her daughter might still be alive, somewhere waiting to be found. But as the years passed without any sign of Cathy, that hope transformed into a deep and abiding sorrow. She became a shell of the vibrant woman she once was, consumed by the what ifs and the endless cycle of imagining what might have happened to her little girl. Claire's suffering was not limited to the emotional toll, it also took a heavy toll on her mental health. The constant unanswered questions led to bouts of depression and anxiety, making everyday life a struggle. The family home, once filled with the laughter and energy of three daughters, became a place of quiet, punctuated by reminders of Cathy's absence. Claire never fully recovered from the loss, and though she continued to fight for answers, the psychological burden of living in limbo took away her joy. Even in her later years, she never stopped wondering what had happened to Cathy, and that wonder ate away at her spirit. Cathy's siblings, though younger at the time of her disappearance, also bore the brunt of her loss. Losing a sister under such mysterious and tragic circumstances marked them for life. They were forced to grow up in the shadow of Cathy's absence, always aware that their family was incomplete. The disappearance not only robbed them of their sister, but it also forever changed their relationship with their parents. Lyman and Claire, consumed by the search for Cathy, were unable to fully be present for their other children in the same way. The grief had fractured the family dynamic, making it difficult to navigate a life that would never feel whole again. As Cathy's case grew colder, her siblings lived in a state of perpetual uncertainty, never knowing if one day the answers would come. They carried the burden of the unsolved mystery with them, knowing that, unlike many families who lose a loved one, they had no resolution, no grave to visit, no place to say goodbye. The absence of closure, the never ending questions, and the sense of injustice affected every aspect of their lives. Relationships, careers, and their own sense of identity were shaped by the trauma of living in a family marked by loss. The psychological toll of Cathy's disappearance was profound, but it was also largely invisible to the outside world. People saw a family who had lost a daughter, but they couldn't see the countless sleepless nights, the moments of breaking down in private, or the quiet longing for answers that would never come. The Moultons lived with a haunting uncertainty every single day, wondering if Cathy had suffered, if she was still alive somewhere, or if they would ever know the truth. In the end, Cathy's disappearance did more than just take her from them. It reshaped the very fabric of their family's existence. It left wounds that time couldn't heal and a grief that never found its proper place. For the Moultons, the tragedy of Cathy's vanishing wasn't just in the act itself, but in the long, drawn out agony of never knowing, of living in a state of perpetual waiting, hoping for answers that never came. The loss of Cathy Moulton marked the Moulton family forever. Though they carried on with their lives in whatever ways they could, the shadow of her disappearance was ever present, a constant reminder of the cruel uncertainty that defined their existence. The lack of closure left them adrift, with hearts full of sorrow and minds tormented by questions that would never be answered. Decades after Cathy Moulton vanished into the unknown, her family was tormented by whispers of potential discoveries, unconfirmed reports of human remains that might finally offer answers to the mystery of her fate. Over the years, multiple instances of remains being found in rural areas across Maine and neighboring states sparked hopes that Cathy's case might finally reach a resolution. However, each of these reports was met with cautious optimism, as none could be definitively linked to her. One of the more prominent instances occurred in the late 1980s when skeletal remains were found near a rural road in Maine. The location raised alarm bells, as it was not far from where some speculated Cathy could have been taken. For the Moulton family, this discovery felt like a potential turning point. However, after forensic testing, the remains were determined to belong to another individual, not Cathy. This was not the only time the family would face such disappointment. Over the years, similar discoveries of unidentified human remains led to fresh investigations, but none yielded a connection to Cathy. In another instance, in the 2000s, a set of remains was discovered in a wooded area not far from Portland. Again, hopes were raised that this might finally bring closure to Cathy's family. Investigators thoroughly examined the site and sent the remains for testing. But once again, the results came back inconclusive or unrelated to Cathy's case. Despite the occasional spark of hope, every lead regarding remains ended in disappointment, leaving the Moultons without the answers they so desperately sought. These reports, while unconfirmed, were treated seriously by law enforcement who would reopen the case files each time such a discovery was made. Investigators cross referenced the locations and details of these remains with known missing persons cases from the area. But the inability to link any of these finds to Cathy kept her case firmly in the realm of unsolved mysteries. For the Moultons, these unconfirmed reports were agonizing. Each discovery brought the possibility of closure, but often led to more heartache. The hope that Cathy's remains might one day be found kept the investigation alive, but the continued lack of answers only deepened the family's unresolved grief. While Cathy's case grew colder over the decades, it never truly disappeared from the public eye, thanks in large part to the media's role in keeping her story alive. In the years following her disappearance, local newspapers regularly updated the public on the investigation, and Cathy's face became a constant reminder of the unsolved tragedy. Her family worked tirelessly to ensure that her story would not be forgotten, making use of any platform available to keep the spotlight on Cathy's case. As the years wore on and Cathy's story began to fade from daily headlines, the rise of true crime as a genre reignited interest in her case. Television programs such as Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted featured segments on Cathy, drawing national attention to her disappearance. These programs often relied on public engagement, urging viewers to call in with tips or information. While Cathy's case didn't receive the same kind of explosive breakthroughs that some other cold cases did, the consistent coverage kept her memory alive and ensured that her case remained on the radar of law enforcement and the public alike. In the 21st century, Cathy's disappearance gained further attention through the explosion of true crime podcasts and documentaries. Shows dedicated to cold cases began re examining her story, piecing together the known facts and raising new questions. These platforms allowed a new generation of amateur detectives and true crime enthusiasts to delve into Cathy's case, bringing fresh eyes to old evidence. The detailed explorations of Cathy's disappearance through podcasts and documentaries not only kept the case in the public consciousness, but also sparked renewed interest from people who may have long forgotten about the missing girl from Portland, Maine. Through social media, Cathy's story reached an even broader audience. Websites and forums dedicated to unsolved cases allowed for deeper discussions, speculation, and information sharing. Amateur sleuths, some inspired by podcasts or documentaries, took it upon themselves to revisit the case, looking for clues that might have been overlooked by investigators. While no major breakthroughs have emerged, the media's consistent focus on Cathy's case ensured that it remained active and relevant even decades after her disappearance. As of today, Cathy Moulton's case remains unsolved. It has officially been classified as a cold case, but it is far from forgotten. Advances in forensic technology, including DNA testing and the use of genetic genealogy, have given new hope to investigators working on cold cases. While Cathy's case has yet to benefit from these breakthroughs, there remains a possibility that new evidence could surface or that remains found in the future could be definitively linked to her through modern technology. In recent years, cold case units across the country have been re examining old files, looking for new angles or potential connections that may have been missed in earlier investigations. Cathy's case remains part of this broader effort, with law enforcement keeping it open in the event that new leads or developments arise. The Moulton family has worked closely with investigators throughout the years, and while no active searches are underway, the case has never been officially closed. Authorities continue to believe that Cathy's disappearance was the result of foul play, though who was responsible remains a mystery. While Nathaniel Bar-Jonah remains a credible suspect in the eyes of many, there is still no direct evidence linking him or anyone else to Cathy's abduction. The lack of physical evidence, such as remains or belongings, has hampered the investigation from the beginning, leaving law enforcement with limited avenues to pursue. Despite the cold nature of the case, Cathy's disappearance remains part of Maine's history, and her story continues to haunt those who remember the day she vanished. Law enforcement officials maintain that the investigation is technically active, and with continued advances in forensic science, there is always hope that one day Cathy's case will find its long overdue resolution. The disappearance of Cathy Moulton is a tragic reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictable cruelty that can strike when least expected. Cathy was a bright, responsible, and beloved young girl whose life was stolen in an instant, leaving behind a family shattered by grief and a community forever changed by the unsolved mystery. Her case is one of many unsolved disappearances from the 1970s, a time when the limitations of technology and the lack of immediate urgency from law enforcement often allowed cases to grow cold before they even had a chance to be solved. Kathy's family has been living with the weight of unanswered questions for over 50 years. The psychological toll of never knowing what happened to her has shaped their lives in profound ways. Her parents, Lyman and Claire, passed away without ever receiving the closure they so desperately sought. Kathy's siblings, too, have carried the burden of her disappearance throughout their lives, grappling with the lingering pain and the haunting absence of their sister. Beyond her family, Kathy's case has had a broader impact on the community and on law enforcement practices. Her disappearance, like many from that era, highlighted the need for more urgent responses to missing persons cases, especially those involving teenagers. In the decades since Cathy vanished, law enforcement agencies have become better equipped to handle such cases with advancements in forensic technology and improved protocols that ensure cases like Cathy's are not written off as runaways or left to grow cold. Cathy Moulton's story remains a symbol of the enduring pain that unsolved mysteries leave behind. It speaks to the need for closure, not just for the families of victims, but for society as a whole. Cases like Cathy's continue to remind us of the importance of never giving up on the search for truth, no matter how many years have passed. The Moulton family, along with the broader public, still holds on to hope that one day someone will come forward with new information or that a breakthrough in forensic science will finally reveal the truth. Cathy's disappearance is more than just a cold case. It is a story of a life interrupted, of a family left in limbo, and of a community that still remembers. The search for closure may never truly end, but the hope that justice will one day be served continues to flicker, keeping Cathy's memory alive and her story from fading into history. Imagine the anguish of living for decades with no answers, no closure, and a constant void where a loved one should be. Cathy Moulton's disappearance is not just a story from the past. It's a reminder that unsolved cases can haunt families, communities, and even entire generations. But every cold case, no matter how old, can still be solved. Cathy's story, like so many others, is waiting for that one vital clue, that one piece of information that could finally bring justice. If you believe someone out there holds the key to this unsolved mystery, now is the time to speak up. Share this video, spread Cathy's story, and help keep her case alive. It only takes one tip, one memory, or one small detail to break through the silence. Don't let Cathy's story fade away. Subscribe for updates on this and other cold cases and join the conversation in the comments. Together, we can ensure that Cathy and others like her are never forgotten and that one day justice is served.